Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something that's been making headlines and sparking some pretty heated debates here in Canada.
Oh, yeah.
The future of medical assistance in dying. MAiD, as it's better known.
Definitely going to get interesting.
It is going to get interesting.
It will.
And to guide us on today's deep dive, we have an article from the MAiD in Canada Substack.
Okay.
Titled, What a Conservative Federal Government Could Do to Restrict Access to Medical Assistance in Dying in Canada. Now, this article doesn't exactly shy away from its own opinion.
Right.
It leans pretty heavily towards continued access to MAiD being vital.
Mm-hmm.
But for our purposes today, we're going to be focusing on understanding the facts and the potential changes we might see on the horizon.
Yeah, it's important.
It is important. So to set the scene, the Canadian federal election's right around the corner.
Yeah.
And the Conservative Party's stance on MAiD is front and center.
Right. They've
Why?
been pretty vocal about their opposition to it. But to really understand the potential changes, we need some background.
MAiD has been legal in Canada since 2016.
Right.
Thanks to a groundbreaking Supreme Court decision, Carter v. Canada.
Yeah.
Back then, access was pretty restricted, though.
Uh-huh.
You had to have a reasonably foreseeable death to qualify.
That's where the Canadian context gets really interesting.
Oh, how so?
Well, unlike a lot of other countries, MAiD in Canada isn't just based on laws passed by Parliament.
Oh, okay.
It's rooted in court rulings and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees certain basic rights and freedoms to all Canadians.
Ah, so that's why just changing the law might not be so simple.
Exactly. Any attempt to restrict MAiD is likely to face legal challenges,
Okay.
possibly even going back to the Supreme Court.
That makes sense. So after Carter v. Canada, there were more court cases.
Right.
Which led to broader access.
Yes.
The reasonably foreseeable death requirement was even loosened,
Right.
which is particularly relevant to our deep dive today.
It is, because that's one of the areas where our article suggests a conservative government might focus their efforts.
Okay, got it. And to help us kind of navigate this maze, the article breaks down the potential changes into three categories.
Right.
Likely, unlikely, and not at all likely.
Okay.
So let's start with the likely category, shall we?
Sounds good to me.
First up, tightening eligibility criteria. And one way they might do that is by reinstating that reasonably foreseeable death requirement. Can you break that down for us?
So there's a key court case, Trishan v. Canada. It ruled in 2019 that the reasonably foreseeable death requirement was unconstitutional. Now, interestingly, the government at the time chose not to appeal that decision.
So it created a loophole.
Exactly. And that's what a conservative government could use to try and bring back that requirement.
Now, I can see how this might raise some concerns. This wouldn't impact everyone equally, would it?
No, it wouldn't. It would disproportionately impact individuals with those chronic debilitating conditions where death isn't immediately imminent.
Okay.
You know, people with Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, or ALS.
Right.
They might be experiencing terrible suffering, but their death might not be considered reasonably foreseeable in the legal sense.
And the article suggests that a conservative government might frame this restriction as a way to protect vulnerable populations.
Yes, but you have to acknowledge the tension between that argument and the concept of individual autonomy.
Right.
The right of each person to make decisions about their own life, even when those decisions are difficult.
That's a good point. It's not just about the legal technicalities, it's about the values at stake.
Absolutely. That clash of values is going to be at the heart of every debate about MAiD.
Okay, so one potential change down. What's next?
Next up is the potential exclusion of mental illness as a sole criterion for MAiD eligibility.
Ah, yes, this is a big one. The current plan is to expand MAiD eligibility in 2027 to include people whose sole underlying condition is a mental illness.
That's right.
And as you can imagine, this has been a very controversial topic. Some people worry about the complexities of mental illness, you know, the potential for misdiagnosis and the difficulty of assessing capacity for informed consent. But doesn't excluding mental illness raise concerns about discrimination?
It does.
If someone with a physical condition causing unbearable suffering has access to MAiD,
Right.
shouldn't someone with an equally unbearable mental condition have that same right to choose?
It's a valid point.
Yeah.
And it gets to the core of how we define suffering and who deserves access to relief.
So the article suggests that a conservative government might try to delay or completely repeal the planned expansion for mental illness.
They might.
What other tools would they have?
Yeah, the article mentions enhancing safeguards and increasing procedural barriers.
Okay.
This would mean adding more steps and requirements to the process, making it more complex and potentially more difficult for people to navigate.
Okay, so break that down for us. What kind of safeguards are we talking about here?
Well, one example is extending waiting periods. Currently, there's already a mandatory reflection period for individuals whose death isn't considered reasonably foreseeable. A conservative government could make that period much longer.
So even if someone meets all the eligibility criteria and has made a carefully considered decision, they might have to wait even longer.
Potentially while they're experiencing unbearable suffering. Yes.
Wow.
They could also reinstate the 10-day waiting period for individuals with a foreseeable natural death.
Okay.
That was part of the original 2016 law.
So more waiting, more obstacles, anything else?
The article also discusses the possibility of making second opinions more rigorous.
Okay.
Right now, you need approval from 2 independent medical practitioners to access MAiD.
Right.
They could make that even more stringent, like requiring a mandatory psychiatric evaluation, even if mental illness isn't the primary reason someone is seeking MAiD.
So we could be talking about 3 or even 4 medical opinions.
Potentially.
That seems like a pretty big barrier, especially for people who are already going through so much.
Absolutely. And then there's the potential for increased documentation and oversight.
Okay.
Adding layers of paperwork, more forms to fill out, more approvals to get. They could even require approval from regional or national review boards, which could add months of delays to the process.
Oh, that's a lot to handle. Anything else? There's this whole section on...
Strengthening conscience rights for healthcare providers.
Yeah, that's the one. Now, before we really dig in, can you maybe break down what conscience rights even means in this context? Like, what are we even talking about here?
Sure. So basically, it's the idea that healthcare providers, doctors, nurses, you name it, have the right to refuse to participate in procedures that they personally object to on moral or religious grounds.
Okay, so it's like their personal beliefs could come into play.
Exactly. And when it comes to MAiD, which is a pretty complex and sensitive issue to begin with, you can see how a healthcare provider's own beliefs about life and death could really factor into their willingness to be involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And the report suggests that a conservative government might actually strengthen these conscience rights even further than they are now.
They're proposing that healthcare providers not only have the right to refuse to provide MAiD themselves, which is sort of already the case, but also to refuse to refer patients to other providers who would be willing to do it.
Whoa, hold on. So even if a patient meets all the criteria for MAiD, a doctor who objects to it could just say, nope, not doing it. And I'm not even telling you where you can go to get it done.
Potentially, yeah. And that's where things get really tricky, because then it becomes not just about a doctor's personal beliefs, but about potentially blocking access to a legally available medical procedure.
Exactly. And that's what I find really worrying about this whole thing. Like, what kind of impact would that have on people actually seeking MAiD? We've covered a lot of ground here in the likely category.
We have. And remember, this is just the first of 3 categories of potential changes we're going to explore.
So much more to unpack. But before we move on, I want to bring you, the listener, into the conversation.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts so far? What stands out to you from what we've discussed? What questions are popping into your mind as we navigate this complex topic? Think about the potential impact these changes could have both for individuals seeking MAiD and for our understanding of choice and autonomy in Canada.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. We'll be back soon with part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll explore the unlikely and not at all likely categories of potential changes to MAiD in Canada under a new conservative government. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're continuing our exploration of potential changes to MAiD in Canada under a new conservative government.
Right.
We covered a lot of ground in that first part, focusing on the changes considered most likely to occur.
Right.
And now we're moving into murkier waters with the unlikely category. These are changes that are less certain, but, even the possibility of change can have a ripple effect.
For sure. Even discussing these potential changes sheds light on the, ongoing tension surrounding MAiD and the diverse perspectives on end-of-life care in Canada.
Okay, so first up on this unlikely list is restricting provincial flexibilities.
Okay.
Now, I know MAiD is federally regulated, but provinces have some leeway in how they actually implement it, right?
That's right. Provinces have a say in things like setting specific guidelines for MAiD assessments, allocating funding for MAiD providers, and even determining the logistics of how MAiD is delivered within their healthcare systems.
Okay.
They have a surprising amount of autonomy.
So how could a federal government, even a conservative one, exert influence on provincial policies?
Right.
It's not like they could just dictate terms, can they?
Well, that's where the complexities of Canadian healthcare funding come in.
Okay.
A big chunk of provincial healthcare budgets comes from federal transfers.
Right.
A conservative government could potentially use that as leverage.
Oh, I see what you mean.
You know, imagine them saying, sure, we'll transfer these healthcare funds, but only if you implement MAiD in a way that aligns with our values.
So it's not about forcing the provinces to do anything, but more like incentivizing them to play ball.
Yeah.
Kind of a follow our rules or you lose funding situation.
It's definitely a delicate balancing act. And it raises all sorts of ethical questions. You know, is it right for the federal government to use funding as a tool to influence healthcare decisions that are at least partially under provincial jurisdiction?
It sounds like this could lead to a very uneven landscape for MAiD access across the country.
It could.
What if some provinces cave to the pressure and restrict MAiD while others stand their ground?
That's the worry, isn't it?
Yeah.
We could end up with a situation where your access to MAiD depends on where you live.
Right.
It becomes a postcode lottery, which feels inherently unfair.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity to an already complex issue.
Ugh.
Okay, let's move on to the second item in the unlikely category, limiting MAiD to healthcare settings.
Right.
This one feels particularly personal.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah. Currently, individuals can choose to receive MAiD in a variety of settings, including their own homes.
Right.
This is often seen as a way to provide comfort, privacy, and a sense of control during those final moments. I can see how that would be incredibly meaningful for people. So how would this restriction work in practice?
Imagine a law that mandates that MAiD can only be provided in designated healthcare facilities,
Okay.
like hospitals or specialized clinics.
Got it.
Suddenly, the option of dying in the comfort of your own home, surrounded by loved ones, is off the table.
I imagine the justification would be something about ensuring proper medical oversight and control,
Right.
right?
They-
Preventing any potential errors or abuses.
They might argue that by restricting the locations, they're adding a layer of safety. But is that sense of security worth sacrificing individual choice?
Right.
Isn't the freedom to choose where and how you die a fundamental right?
And wouldn't this disproportionately impact people in rural or remote communities?
Right.
What if they don't have easy access to a major healthcare facility?
It's a valid concern. It could create a situation where someone who qualifies for MAiD and has made a deeply personal decision is denied access simply because of where they live.
And then there's the emotional and psychological aspect, being forced to die in a sterile, unfamiliar environment, rather than a place that holds meaning and comfort.
Right.
That feels like adding another layer of suffering to an already difficult situation.
This is where those fundamental values clashes that we've been talking about really come to the forefront.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have the desire for control and oversight
Right.
to ensure everything is done by the book, so to speak. And on the other hand, you have the deeply personal individual choice of how and where you want to spend your final moments.
It's a tough balancing act.
It is.
Okay, so we've explored two potential unlikely scenarios restricting provincial flexibility and limiting MAiD to healthcare settings. Both seem to raise more questions than they answer.
They do, and they highlight the complex web of consideration surrounding MAiD. You know,
Yeah.
It's not just about legal technicalities. It's about the very essence of what constitutes a good death in our society.
Let's move on to the not at all likely scenarios, where the article explores the most extreme possibilities.
Right.
The first one is a near total ban on MAiD.
Okay.
Now, it's important to emphasize that this is highly improbable, but it's worth considering as a thought experiment, to understand the potential extremes of this debate.
Okay.
So paint me a picture. What would a near total ban actually look like?
Imagine a scenario where MAiD is only available to individuals with terminal illnesses
Right.
who are literally in their final weeks of life.
Got it.
And even then, they would have to jump through countless hoops, multiple specialists signing off on their request,
Okay.
mandatory counseling sessions, expensive mental health evaluations to ensure they're of sound mind, and potentially even a national oversight board with strong anti-MAiD views having the final say.
Wow, that's a lot of hurdles to clear.
It is.
It almost feels like intentionally making the process so burdensome that it becomes unfeasible for most people.
That's the point, isn't it?
Yeah.
To create so many barriers that MAiD, while technically legal, is practically out of reach for most individuals.
But wouldn't such a drastic restriction be immediately challenged in court? I mean,
Yeah.
the Supreme Court has already affirmed the right to MAiD in Canada.
Absolutely. But legal challenges, even if ultimately successful, take time.
Right.
And during that time, access to MAiD could be severely limited, leaving countless individuals in a state of limbo.
Yeah.
Imagine facing unbearable suffering with no end in sight, knowing that relief is technically available but practically unattainable.
That's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
So even if such a ban were eventually overturned, the process itself could cause immense harm and distress.
It underscores the fact that this isn't just some abstract legal debate. We're talking about real people's lives, their choices, their right to die with dignity.
Okay, so we've explored the likely, unlikely, and now the not at all likely scenarios.
Yeah, a lot to process.
It's a lot to process. We've been exploring the potential changes to MAiD in Canada under a new conservative government, focusing on those, likely, unlikely, and even the not at all likely scenario.
Yeah, a lot to cover.
And now in this final part, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on the bigger picture.
Okay.
What are the broader implications of this whole debate,
Yeah.
for Canadian society?
Yeah.
What's at stake here beyond those specific policy changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's important to start by acknowledging that
Okay.
even if a conservative government doesn't enact any of those specific changes we talked about, the very process itself, the potential for restrictions, the court battles that would inevitably follow raises some really important issues.
I see what you mean. Just the threat of change, that uncertainty it creates, can have a real impact on people's lives.
It can.
Imagine someone who's considering MAiD, weighing that incredibly difficult decision.
Right.
Suddenly, the possibility that that option might be taken away, that the window is closing, adds a whole new layer of pressure.
Exactly. That uncertainty can have very real consequences.
Yeah.
It might lead people to make decisions sooner than they otherwise would have,
Right.
out of fear that the choice will be taken away from them.
That's such a tough position to be in, feeling forced into making such a deeply personal decision because of political maneuvering doesn't feel right.
It highlights the power dynamics at play,
Yeah.
The article we've been discussing uses the term paternalistic to describe some of the justifications for restricting MAiD, this idea that the government knows better than individuals what's in their best interests when it comes to end-of-life choices.
Yeah, that definitely struck a chord with me.
Right.
Who are we to impose our beliefs about what constitutes a good death
Right.
on someone who is facing the end of their life?
And it raises another crucial issue, the role of the courts in shaping social values.
Okay.
We've already talked about how MAiD in Canada is rooted in court rulings, not just legislation passed by Parliament.
Right. It's not just about what politicians decide. It's about how those decisions are interpreted and upheld by the judicial system.
Exactly. And if a conservative government were to significantly restrict MAiD, you can bet those restrictions would be challenged in court. We could be looking at years of legal battles with the Supreme Court, potentially having to weigh in on the very essence of what MAiD means in Canada.
This is so much bigger than just ticking boxes on a policy checklist.
It is.
It's about who gets to decide, whose voices are heard, and how those decisions impact the very fabric of our society.
Absolutely. And it underscores the importance of informed public discourse,
Yeah.
of engaging in these difficult conversations with nuance and empathy. We need to move beyond the sound bites and slogans and really grapple with what matters most to us as individuals and as a nation.
So after this deep dive, what are your parting thoughts for our listeners? What do you hope they take away from this exploration of MAiD in Canada?
I hope they come away with a deeper understanding of the complexities of this issue. Recognizing that there are no easy answers, I hope they feel empowered to continue learning to engage in thoughtful conversations and to advocate for the kind of end-of-life care that aligns with their values.
Beautifully said. It's not about finding the right answer, but about fostering understanding and compassion in the face of difficult choices. And I hope that's something we've been able to achieve in this deep dive.
I think so too. It's been a privilege to unpack this with you and to share these reflections with our listeners.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. Keep those thinking caps on. Keep asking questions and keep diving deep. Until next time.